April 27th, 2011. For those of you who've lived in the state of Alabama, that date might mean something to you. For those of you who weren't living here, or maybe I need to jog your memory, that was the date when one of the deadliest tornado outbreaks in history hit Alabama. And it left a lot of destruction throughout the entire state and surrounding areas. Personally, I remember that day pretty well. Christy and I had only been married a few months at the time, not even, like a little over a month at the time. We had our first small apartment together in Huntsville, and so I remember that we got off work early. We worked at the same place, and so we got off work early, and we're just like, hey, free day off, so we're going to go just take a nap and enjoy our afternoon. And so for me, I wasn't that worried. I had just moved here less than a year before from Oklahoma City, and we got a lot of tornadoes there, and so, I was supposed to be an expert or whatever. Tornado warnings were something that I was pretty used to at the time. But I remember waking up from our nap and you just kind of sense that something was different. Sometimes you get warnings and then nothing pans out. But this time there was something different. And there was, on average, Alabama receives about 65 tornadoes every year. And that day alone, there was 62. And so obviously there were casualties throughout the whole state. There was chaos. And if you remember that, many of you remember that you saw up close and personal the damage that natural disasters can cause. You saw the destruction of storms. And maybe some of you have seen a tornado or been caught in a tornado either that day or another day. I remember when I was a kid, there was one pretty close to us, and just seeing it pretty massive up close and personal. It's a pretty terrifying thing. And certain days like that, you just kind of remember. Stuff hits close to home. You remember a lot about that day. And one thing that's always intriguing to me is in times like that, either natural disasters or things like 9/11, people tend to be drawn to each other in those times, right? And a lot of things just kind of fall away because what's important kind of comes to the forefront. I remember people would just be grilling out on the deck, sharing food, just inviting people over, people you've never met before, right? And you're just, the food's going to go bad anyway, so everybody's getting it out and just sharing food. You're going to hang out if you have family close, you're checking in on them, maybe even going to stay with them if your power's out anyways, just all kind of huddled together in the living room, just hanging out because at least you have each other. And one of the things that we as humans desire in these moments of crisis and these moments of chaos is closeness. We like to be present with others. It gives us this sense of comfort, right? And kind of maybe a small glimpse of normalcy when our minds are racing with fear because of the unknown, because of the current situation. When we feel helpless and out of control, we gain comfort knowing that at least we're not alone in the chaos. It's why kids run to their parents' room in the middle of the night, right? When there's a big storm. They know that because of the presence of their parents, they're going to be okay. Or at least it makes them feel that way. Today in our story, we're going to see a group of disciples who are in this helpless, fearful, chaotic situation. But in the midst of it, we're also going to see Jesus who is present with them in their chaos. But what makes this Jesus stand out from just a kid running to his or her parents in the middle of the night is that Jesus is not only present, but he is also powerful. And it makes all the difference, as we're going to see in our time today. It's the entire theme of our message, the presence and power of Jesus. The power and presence of Jesus. As I said earlier, I do want to welcome you to this gathering of New Eden Church. For those of you who don't know, our mission here is, let me tell you our vision first. Our vision is the flourishing of Decatur for the good of the world and the glory of God. And our mission is to make disciples who worship King Jesus, who abide in King Jesus, and who reflect King Jesus to the world and all of life. And I mean it when I say I'm super grateful to have you all on this mission with us. As you heard read earlier, our text today comes from John 6, verses 16 through 21. We'll have the verses on the screen if you want to follow along that way, or you can also follow along in your copy of the scriptures. This story is a fairly familiar story. It's Jesus walking on the water. Kind of like last week when Jesus fed the 5,000. If you grew up in church at all, you probably heard this story in some kind of setting, maybe a Sunday school or a church service. And maybe the moral of the story was that Jesus can calm the storms of your life. And while that's not entirely untrue at all, Jesus can and he does. But if we're not careful, that moral in and of itself can just kind of become reductionistic and trite. Because if we're honest, like we hear that story and it doesn't deal with the questions that you and I face. What happens when you're in the storm and it doesn't stop? What happens when you pray and nothing changes? What happens when, even though you're told Jesus is present with you in the storm, it doesn't really feel like it and you can't see him anywhere? What do we do then? See, as we look closer, we're going to see that yes, Jesus does calm the storms of your life, but there's so much more going on in this story than meets the eye. See, in Christ, God is not just dealing with one storm. He is dealing with all chaos, with all storms through the presence and the power of Jesus. And so let's see how this all unfolds. I think it'd be helpful to just look at the immediate context of the story, and then we're going to kind of zoom out and see what it means. How the author is driving us to dependence on Jesus. So let's dive into the story. Look again at verses 16 and 17. It says, when evening came, his disciples went down to the sea, got into a boat, and started across the sea to Capernaum. Darkness had already set in, but Jesus had not yet come to them. If you remember last week, the setting for our story, Jesus had just got done feeding over 15,000 people with 5 loaves and 2 fish. And so after this happened, this crowd wants Jesus to become their earthly king, free them from earthly oppression, that's part of what Jesus came to do, but ultimately comes to free everyone from sin and death. And so he steals away back up to the mountain where he had just been with his disciples when the crowd came to find him. And so after all this takes place, Jesus is still up on the mountain. I don't know what all the disciples had to do. Maybe they had to clean up afterwards. And they're like, well, Jesus is nowhere to be found. He got away. It's like cleaning up for a wedding when the couple's gone. And you're like, man, we did all this for you. And you're out of here on your honeymoon. And then you just got to clean up. And it's, the disciples are handling all this. Everybody kind of disperses. Still don't see Jesus around. They're like, well, let's just get in a boat and head over to Capernaum. I'm sure he'll catch up to us at some point, right? Probably wasn't the first time this had happened. I'm sure there were times where Jesus would just disappear. Like, all right, let's keep doing our thing, I guess, for a little bit. And Jesus will randomly show up at some point. And so, these men had done this multiple times before. They hop on this boat. Many of these men were fishermen, very experienced seamen. They get on the boat. They knew what this was like. They're just going to head over the 7 or 8 miles across the sea. And look what we find in verse 18. A high wind arose and the sea began to churn. And so this storm comes up out of nowhere and the sea begins to churn, as the author of John tells us. In the Matthew gospel account, we're told that they were, quote, battered by the waves because the wind was against them. So this is no small storm. Immediately they're in trouble. And so they do what they know how to do best. We're told that they begin to row, right? So they try to start controlling the boat because the wind isn't taking them the direction they need to go. They're being battered by the waves. And so they just try to start rowing and taking control over the boat. Right? They move to doing the best they can to control the situation. So we're told in the next verse, they row for about 3 to 4 miles. Now, no one's sitting there keeping track of how far they've rowed in the middle of the storm, right? But as best John can recount the story, about 3 to 4 miles they're rowing. Now that's a long way, and I don't know if you've ever tried to row a boat, even in just like simple, settings, but not especially in the middle of a storm. Like, this is no joke. Like, you're getting an absolute workout. They're probably taking turns, just trying to survive. And I don't know if you've ever been in a situation where at first you're like, oh, I've dealt with this before, no big deal. And then very quickly it turns into this life-threatening thing, and you're just like, at that point, almost panicking, trying to figure out, what do we just do to survive? And so this is where the disciples are. They're like, this is no small storm. They're just trying to survive, wearing themselves out. And this is when we're told that Jesus shows up. Look at verse 19. After they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, so they're probably about right in the middle of the sea, they saw Jesus walking on the sea. He was coming near the boat, and they were afraid. Other gospel accounts kind of fill in the gap for us on why they were afraid. They thought this was a ghost. See, no human should be able to handle being in the water in a storm like this, even swimming, let alone just walking on the sea. And so the disciples are scared. But Jesus lets them know that it's him. That's what we read in verse 20. He says to them, "It is I. Don't be afraid. It's me. You don't have to be scared." So Jesus shows up in the midst of this desperate situation and tells them not to be scared. But what I love about this, and something we need to notice, is that he doesn't just tell them, hey guys, don't be scared. he tells them the reason why they don't have to be scared, and that's because Jesus is with them. See, God never tells us not to fear simply as a command without also telling us the reason why we don't have to fear. That command is tied to the character of God. That's what Joshua 1:9, when God told Joshua not to fear, he says, haven't I commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Don't be afraid or discouraged. Why? For the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. And this is where we begin to see in our story the presence of Jesus, which is so sweet. Jesus could have just left his disciples to fend for themselves, but he refuses to do so. He comes to them in the middle of this helpless, discouraging situation, and he makes himself known to them, and he says, it's me. You no longer have to be afraid. The language here in the Greek reads as if you don't have to keep being afraid. It's actually an indicative statement that is a result of the truth that Jesus is present more than it is an imperative that you just need to kind of white knuckle yourself into not being afraid. Like you can somehow make your heart just stop being scared. No, it's like, hey, because I'm here and I'm present, hey guys, you don't have to be scared anymore. It's okay. I'm here. Now, this alone would have caused them a level of comfort. Remember, they've seen Jesus work miracles. Now, maybe nothing this big, but maybe Jesus would have a level of resourcefulness that they didn't have. So just his presence would have helped them, but I also want you to notice not only the presence of Jesus, but also his power. Look at verse 21. Then they were willing to take him on board, and at once the boat was at the shore where they were headed. Other gospel accounts, again, tell us that the storm immediately ceased at the word of Jesus' mouth. So the disciples receive Jesus onto the boat. They welcome him in even before the storm had stopped. They invite his presence into their boat, and immediately the situation is fixed. Not only does the storm stop, but they arrive at the shore where they were headed. See, the presence of someone is a sweet thing. It really is. But what I love about Jesus is that he's not only present in our trials, but he also has the power to do something about it. This is the power of Jesus. See, for Jesus to empathize with our weaknesses is not enough. It's a sweet thing, and it's very important, but for him to just feel sorry for us doesn't change our plight. We can all feel sorry for each other and sit around in a circle and do that. He does do that, but he does so much more. He's also powerful enough to do something. Of course, he can walk on the sea. He was the one that at the beginning spoke the sea into existence. And so here in this situation, Jesus crosses the sea to meet his disciples, to be present with them, but also he flexes his muscles and shows his power. He deals with their issue and solves their problem. And so the easy thing to do here would kind of, short story, let's just stop at the cursory reading of the text. Tell you that Jesus is present with you in the storms of life. He's powerful enough to do something about it. He'll deliver you from them. Let's just pack it up, sing a couple songs, go home. But honestly, as we said earlier, I know the storms that some of you are facing, and that would be trite and cliche. I know your stories. I know many of you. I know you've been in storms where Jesus doesn't seem present. And if he does seem present, he seems pretty powerless because he's not changing the circumstance. So what do we do about this? I know that personally in my own life as well, where we seem just stuck in the middle of the situation. And so what does this story mean for us today? For the disciples, it meant another powerful sign that legitimized the message that Jesus was proclaiming. But what does it mean for us in the here and now? And to see this, let's look a little closer at this story. If you remember, before John ever started this section of his book at the beginning of chapter 6, he told us a clue about when this took place. That kind of seemed out of place, but I think it matters. Look back at John 6:4. He said, now the Passover, a Jewish festival, was near. So immediately we have to understand that John gives us this detail before he ever talks about the bread, which we saw last week, and we'll see again next week with this story sandwiched in between. Before he ever talked about that, he let us know that the Passover was near. The Passover was this Jewish festival that marked the Exodus story. This deliverance of God's people from the oppressive hand of Pharaoh, and Israel is set free from them. John is intentionally drawing our minds. He said it explicitly back in John chapter 1, but now he's drawing our minds again to Jesus as the true and better Moses. Jesus as the entire fulfillment of the Exodus, the Passover story. In Numbers 11, Moses asked God, where do we get enough food to feed all these people? And he doubted that God could provide, but God gave them manna from heaven. And we're going to see the significance of Jesus as the true bread from heaven next week, but we kind of get hints at that last week. And then we see, like Moses, Jesus went up and down this mountain communing with God. And just like Moses, he's delivering his people at a sea and bringing them safely to the other side. We need to see this sea here. Even though compared to the other Gospels, John has the shortest account of the story. He mentions the word sea 4 different times, which is more than any other Gospel account. John wants us to see the crossing of this sea as a fulfillment of the Exodus Passover story. If you remember the story, God's people were trapped where they had the sea on one side and Pharaoh's army on the other side, and they didn't know what to do. And then God used Moses to split the Red Sea, and they walked through and come safely on the other side. And in this story today, Jesus is the better Moses, the better prophet, the better king, who frees his people and liberates them, not just from a physical oppressor, but from sin and death itself. Jesus, we say it all the time, but it's true and we need to see it. He's the fulfillment of everything that Moses and the prophets wrote about. On this long walk from Emmaus, Jesus tells and just expounds all this, and he could talk all day about he is the fulfillment of this. Look at Psalm 77:16 on the screen. It says, the water saw you, God. The water saw you. It trembled. In this prophecy, the disciples aren't the one trembling. The water's trembling. Even the depths shook. Your way went through the sea and your path through the vast water, but your footprints were unseen. You led your people like a flock by the hand of Moses and Aaron. And though God's people were once led by unseen footprints, now in Christ, who's come in flesh and made his presence known, is leading his people through the sea and through the vast water, but where they can see up close and personal. It's not some ghost. It's not where his footprints can't be seen. God says, I'm showing myself when I'm flexing my muscles because I am God. Later in Psalms, we're told of a people who cry to the Lord in their distress and he delivers them. Psalm 107:28. Then they cried out to the Lord in their trouble and he brought them out of their distress. He stilled the storm to a whisper and the waves of the sea were hushed. They rejoiced when the waves grew quiet. Then he guided them to the harbor they longed for. See, Jesus is the fulfillment of all this as he walks on the water to meet us in our storm. He is the one who loves you enough to be present in your chaos, and he's also the one who's powerful enough to do something about it. This sea for John's readers and for the Jewish audience would have represented something dark and foreboding. The sea in the scriptures always symbolized sin and death and judgment and chaos. It represented this unknown, this being out of control. And I think of this like when I go to the beach and I'm standing on the ocean and you just look out and you just can't see the end of it. Like imagine being in the middle of a sea or an ocean where you literally cannot see land and a storm arises. I mean, this was what the sea represented, chaos and emptiness. In an article from Table Talk magazine by Professor Doug Ponder, he points out these ideas of the sea. He points out all the way back in Genesis 1, we're told that the sea was dark and formless and empty. It was full of chaos. Later in the Noah story, the sea of God's wrath came over the whole earth because of their rebellion. In the Exodus story specifically, the sea was what trapped them until God showed up and made a safe way for them to avoid the chaos of the sea. In the book of Psalms, the sea is frequently used to symbolize uncertainty and difficulty. In Jonah, if you remember the story, the sea is a sea of judgment and the storms are arising until Jonah is cast into the depths of the sea and then the sea is calmed. In the book of Micah, the sea is where God cast out sin to be judged, forgiven, and forgotten. See, this story is not just telling us that Jesus dealt with one storm at one time and brought the disciples through this one chaotic situation on the sea, and he can kind of do the same with the situation you're facing. I mean, that's a small piece of it. I'm not minimizing that, but we have to keep it in perspective. See, ultimately, Jesus came to deal not just with the sea, but with everything that the sea represented. He came to deal with the chaos of death itself. I mean, that's really why we get scared in situations. We hate death. We hate loss and grief and pain, and we don't want to feel it, so we just try to control it and row the boat and just try to stay afloat so we don't have to feel that because we're scared of it. See, all of us, no matter who we are affected by everything that the sea represents. Sometimes in Scripture, the sea represents the evil from the outside that wants to destroy us, and sometimes it represents the deserved judgment that is a result of our sin that is within us. But Jesus came to deal with both of those problems. We all, like the disciples, when we find ourselves in a storm that either we have created or that is just a result of the fall of the situation in life, we can try to row our way out of it. We can try to work in our own strength, but in the face of the chaotic storm, it's absolutely helpless. Just like when we faced tornadoes in our state a few years back. When they come, we're at the mercy of our sin and chaos. And all we can do is hunker down and hang on and hope that someone can save us. But that's what Jesus does every time. He's the one who is present and powerful and can deal with our mess. He's not scared of it. With his incarnation, with his life, we see his presence most clearly. He didn't just get on a boat with us. He left heaven's comfort and security and safety, and he embodies and takes on flesh and lives as a human. Like, you think he doesn't know what you're going through? He dwelt among us. He lived with us. He got dirty. He ate food. He laughed. He cried. He smelled bad. He sweat. He used the bathroom. He was human. He was misunderstood. He faced impossible situations. He was judged by others. We know, you can know that God is present in your trials because the life of Jesus shows us that he is near to you in your distress. And he's not scared of your mess like we are. When we try to hide it, we don't want anybody to see it, because we know they'll probably run too. That's not Jesus. He walks right into the middle of it. He didn't stay distant from the messy storm of humanity. He could have. But he left his Father's throne and walked into the middle of it. Your mess is not too big for Jesus, no matter what it is, because he can deal with it. And that's what we see in the cross. He deals with the biggest problem, the biggest situation that needs to be dealt with, which is sin. And the sin in the world and the sin in our hearts that causes the chaos. And he absorbed it all. He allowed himself to be plunged into the sea, both the sea of God's wrath and the sea of the evil powers like sin and death and Satan that seek to destroy us, because he knew the only way to calm the storm was for him to be cast right into the depths of it. And just like Jonah, but better, his being plunged into the sea provided a way for our storms to calm. But unlike Jonah, he didn't just go into the belly of a fish. He went into the very belly of hell, and he came back waving the dang keys, because he is not only present, he is powerful. 3 days later, Jonah spit up by the well. 3 days later, Jesus gets back up from death itself. He didn't just walk on the sea, he trampled on the very throat of the enemy. The one who started the chaos in the first place. With his life, we see the presence of Jesus, and in the death and resurrection, we see his power. And he beats death, hell, and the grave for all who put their trust in him. And here's the beauty of it. He didn't just start the work. He's coming back to finish what he started. Revelation 21. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea, which represents chaos and the unknown and destruction, was no more. It's dealt with, finally, completely. I also saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared like a bride adorned for her husband. Then I heard a loud voice from the throne, "Look, God's dwelling, his presence is with humanity, and he will live with them forever. They will be his peoples. God himself will be with them and will be their God. We not only see his presence, but look at his power. Only God could do this. Personally, he himself will wipe away every tear from their eyes. Death will be no more. Grief, all the things that we fear, crying and pain will be no more because the previous things have passed away. Then the one seated on the throne, the one with authority over the sea and all chaos says, look, I'm making everything new. And he says, right, because these words are faithful and true. He is trustworthy. You can believe in him. This giant story is the one that our author wants to remind us of today in the story that he tells us. The one where God himself in the person of Jesus stands above the sea and has authority over all. See, when Jesus told his disciples the reason for them not to be afraid, you remember what he said? He said, it is I, don't be afraid. And this is literally translated, I am. Don't be afraid. You remember this name? I am. We've seen it before. We're going to see it again. I am is the name, Yahweh, God himself. Of course, he can calm the sea. Of course, he's got authority over it. He's present and powerful. And these two things give us comfort in the midst of any storm life throws at us. If he was only present, that wouldn't help deal with the storm. And if he was only powerful, this kind of just distant God, Jesus could have snapped his fingers and stopped the storm. The disciples never knew it was him, but he came and entered in. And so his presence and his power, we get to intimately deal with him and dwell with him. So yes, maybe saying that Jesus is present with you in your storm and that he can deal with it and calm it, it might seem a little trite at times, but it's not untrue. It might not be in your way and in your time and in the way that you would choose and how you want it to be done, but he can and he will deal with it. And we know this because he dealt with the biggest storm of all, sin, death, and the grave. So how much more can he deal with the chaos that life throws at us? And that's why we want you to trust this Jesus, because he's trustworthy, not just as a genie to kind of deal with this temporary stuff, though he does do that, but we want you to trust in him to deal with the biggest storm of your life, your sin. Because that's what we all need. And if you don't know Jesus like that, we implore you to believe in him so that you can have true life. John says, that's why I'm telling you all these stories. That's why I'm showing you all these signs, so that you might have life, you might believe and have life in the name of Jesus. And it's what even those of us who have placed our hope and trust in this Jesus, we need reminders every day, all the time, that this Jesus is who he says he is. And we need to be reminded of our dependence on him. We don't like this because it means us giving up control, stop the rowing, and call on him. Quit trying to do it in our own power and our own strength. And recently, I've had to be reminded of this. The other night, I absolutely lost my temper with my kids. It was one of those things, we were having a good day, and I'm like, man, this is just fun, hanging out with my kids, whatever, going to the park, doing all these things. And it was all over just waiting in a stinking line at a fast food restaurant. So I'm losing my temper with my kids, and then I get upset over this fast food restaurant messing up my order. And then I'm just full of guilt and shame for getting upset. I'm I like to feel like I've got pretty good control over my emotions. I'm pretty self-aware, right? Or so I think. And then I'm what am I doing? Right? I couldn't hide the fact that I had emotions that I did not have control over. And the next morning I was just kind of talking to God about it and processing. What's behind that emotion, right? What's going on there? And I feel like the Spirit brought the word control to me. And I realized the weight of all these things that I had been worrying about, that kind of thought I had control over, thought I was kind of managing pretty well. And I'm just sitting here like the disciples rowing, not even realizing probably the storm going on, but just wearing myself out. And the Spirit graciously reminded me that I did not have to be in control because he was. That even when I see the storm raging, that I can let it rage because he can deal with it. And it was so freeing to me to just let it go. And I'm just sitting there weeping in gratitude and repentance. I need you, and just feeling the presence of Jesus over and over. I'm here. You don't have to be scared. I'm here. You don't have to be afraid anymore. And thankfully, we get the Spirit. That's why Jesus breathes on the Spirit. And what do you see the Spirit in Acts? He's present and He's powerful. He's dwelling in us. You today have the Spirit of God in you, and His power is displayed in your weakness through your life. And it's a beautiful thing when He reminds us, yes, you're weak, and that's okay, because I am strong. And as we invite Him into our lives, just like the disciples did into the boat, even before the storms had ceased, we get intimate insight into His work in the world. We get to feel His presence and see His power up close and personal, sometimes even terrifying. But like a kid who crawls into the arms of her mother, knowing she's safe, even better than that, we can crawl into the arms of Jesus. Because He is the I am, the one who's always been and always will be, who's always present and powerful. We can be encouraged as we hear His voice in the midst of estranged relationships. It's me. Don't be afraid. In the midst of doubt and questions, it's me. Don't be afraid. When facing the fear of sickness or cancer, it's me. You don't have to be afraid. In the midst of finals week, it's me. Don't be afraid. Kids, when you're scared at night because it's dark and you're in your room all alone, it's me. I'm here. You don't have to be afraid. When your marriage is falling apart, it's me. Don't be afraid. When you're facing the fear of the unknown as God's calling you to take that next step in obedience, it's me. Don't be afraid. When you've messed up and you've sinned and you think you're too far gone and no one would ever love you if they saw you in your mess, you hear the voice of Jesus sitting right next by you, it's me. Don't be afraid. When you're scared of the cost of showing mercy and forgiveness to those who've wronged you, it's me. Don't be afraid. When the whole world feels like it's caving in on you and you're just drowning, trying to stay afloat, trying to survive, doing your best, but you know you're utterly failing, it's me. You don't have to be afraid anymore. And because Jesus has come in flesh and beat the biggest storm of all through His life, death, burial, and resurrection, we can believe His voice when we hear Him say, it's me. I'm here. Don't be afraid.